All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling something that, um,
Can be a real pain
yeah,
for hardware creators.
exactly, international product regulations.
Yeah.
You sent us an audio recording all about a new electronic device that you're developing,
Right.
and it sounds like you're thinking about selling it in North America,
Uh-huh.
Australia, and New Zealand, and the European Union.
Mm-hmm.
So we're here to kind of break down those regulations and make sure you're on the right track.
Yeah. You know what's really fascinating about this recording is it gives us a glimpse not only into the regulations themselves, but also like the decision-making process behind testing costs and the potential like traps to avoid.
Yeah.
It's a really cool look into the whole product development journey.
Totally. And you're thinking about that big picture for sure. And it sounds like you really want to understand how to get your product, certified for these different markets.
Right.
So let's start where your recording does with North America.
Okay. So North America, we're talking about the FCC in the US and ICAS in Canada. And from what I gathered, your device doesn't transmit signals.
Yeah.
So it looks like we're probably dealing with regulations under Part 15B or 15C of the FCC rules.
Now, in your recording, you mentioned needing an EMC test report.
Right.
And for anyone just joining us, that's electromagnetic compatibility
Uh-huh.
to make sure your device isn't interfering with other electronics. And you also talk about a supplier's declaration of conformity,
Mm-hmm.
or SDOC for short.
Yep.
Basically, this is a document where the supplier is stating that their product meets the relevant regulations.
Right.
But there's a little bit of confusion in your recording about the SDOC requirements.
Oh, okay.
It almost sounded like you weren't totally sure what had been submitted in the past.
Yeah, and that's a crucial point because it really highlights the need for like a super clear and accurate product specification sheet.
Yeah.
Like this document is the foundation for everything.
Right.
From accurate testing to proving compliance down the line.
Mhm.
Without it, things can get messy fast.
It's like building a house without a blueprint, right? You end up with a wonky door, a
Totally.
window in the wrong place.
Yeah, exactly. So having a detailed spec sheet is going to save you time, money, and a whole lot of potential headaches down the road.
Okay, great point. Moving on. You also talk about Australia and New Zealand.
Down under.
Yes, down under. You need the RCM, the regulatory compliance mark,
Yep.
to sell your device.
Right. And the safety standard that seems relevant here is ASNZS CICR 32.
Okay.
Now, what's particularly interesting is that you mentioned needing separate quotes for testing with and without an SDOC.
Right.
So this kind of hints at how different countries have different approaches to compliance.
So what does that mean for someone like you trying to get this product certified?
Well, getting separate quotes gives you more flexibility, right? So you can choose the approach that best suits your product and your budget.
Okay.
So for example, if you already have a valid SDOC from testing in another region,
Mm-hmm.
you might be able to leverage that and save on costs in Australia and New Zealand.
So it's all about strategic decision making.
Exactly.
Now, from the land of sunshine and barbecues, we head to the European Union where things get a bit more intense.
Oh, yeah. The EU is known for having really strict product regulations.
Yeah.
To sell your product there, it needs to bear the CE marking,
Right.
which means that it complies with a whole bunch of EU directives and standards.
And I remember from your recording, there were a bunch of EN standards mentioned,
Right?
including EN 144846 for child safety
Uh-huh.
and EN 112209 for baby carriers.
Okay, let's break those down a little bit.
Yeah.
EN 144846, that sets safety requirements for children's high chairs,
Mm-hmm.
while EN 12209 focuses on the safety of baby carriers.
Okay.
Now, I know these might seem specific,
Yeah.
but the EU takes a very comprehensive approach to product safety, especially when it comes to children.
So even though your product isn't a high chair or a baby carrier, these standards are still relevant.
Potentially depends on the specifics of your product and its intended use. Like if there's any chance a child could come into contact with your device, you
Right.
need to consider these standards.
Wow, that's something to keep in mind. You definitely sound concerned about the potential cost of testing in the EU.
Yeah.
And there's also some skepticism in your recording about the reliability of some Chinese test labs.
Mm-hmm.
You even mentioned hearing stories of products getting CE markings without actually meeting the standards.
Right. That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
There's always a risk of encountering labs that cut corners or don't fully understand the requirements.
But then you mentioned Xiaomi,
Yeah.
a major Chinese electronics company,
Uh-huh.
and how they do comply with EN 144846.
Right.
It makes you wonder if larger companies with more at stake are just more careful.
That's a good observation. It's possible that larger companies have more resources to dedicate to compliance and are more aware of the potential consequences of non-compliance.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from North America to the Pacific and over to Europe. What are some of the major takeaways from this whirlwind tour of regulations?
Well, first and foremost, a crystal clear product specification sheet is absolutely essential. It's like your passport to compliance.
Yeah.
Second, it's important to understand that different markets have different requirements and approaches.
Right.
What works in one region might not fly in another.
Okay.
And as we've seen with the EU, compliance can be complex and expensive.
Yeah.
It's definitely not something to take lightly.
Absolutely. Cutting corners on compliance can end up costing you more in the long run.
Yeah.
It's all about finding that balance between managing costs and ensuring you're meeting the necessary standards.
Right.
Great insights. Now, in the next part of your recording, you start to delve deeper into the specifics of testing procedures and the decision-making process for choosing the right labs.
Yeah.
This is where things get really interesting.
Picking up where we left off, it sounds like you're really starting to focus on the nitty-gritty of RCM testing in Australia and New Zealand.
Okay.
You want to get a quote for testing 2 different product models, and it seems like both need to comply with that ASNZS CISPR 32 standard we talked about, along with the SDC.
Yeah, and I noticed a bit of confusion in your recording about the cost.
Okay.
You mentioned a figure of 50,000,
Uh-huh.
but it wasn't clear if that was for both models or just one Bentley. I
Yeah.
can see why that would be a concern.
Yeah, it's a great example of why transparency is so important when you're dealing with testing labs. You need like a crystal clear, itemized quote
Right.
that covers all the required standards and models. Otherwise, you risk budget blowouts and delays.
Yeah.
That can really throw a wrench in your plans.
It's like ordering a pizza and finding out they've charged you extra for each topping.
Exactly. You need to know what you're paying for up front.
Yeah.
Now, another interesting point you bring up is the need for a product specification sheet,
Right.
even for something seemingly straightforward like EMC testing. And here's the kicker. You weren't even sure which supplier's circuit board would be used for the testing sample.
I remember that it almost sounded like a to-be-determined situation.
Right.
Why is that such a crucial detail?
Well, imagine baking a cake and swapping out butter for margarine without adjusting the recipe.
Okay.
The end result might not be what you expected.
Right.
Similarly, if the circuit boards from different suppliers aren't identical,
Yeah.
it could throw off the test results.
Okay.
So this highlights the importance of having a tight control over your product's configuration and knowing exactly what components are going into the devices you're sending for testing.
So it's not just about the product itself. It's about managing the entire supply chain to ensure consistency.
Precisely. And in a globalized world, that can be a real challenge.
Right.
But it's a challenge you need to address head on because it directly impacts your ability to comply with regulations.
Okay. So after tackling the complexities of Australia and New Zealand, you shift your focus to the EU.
Right.
You mentioned receiving a quote for testing, but it was in Chinese yuan, and it seemed a lot higher than you anticipated.
Yeah, that's not uncommon. Testing costs in the EU can be quite high, especially given the stringent standards they have in place.
And there was a whole discussion about those different EN standards, some quite specific ones, like the ones for child safety and baby carriers. It felt like a bit of a reality check.
Yeah,
Like meeting those EU requirements was going to be a significant undertaking.
absolutely. And your recording really captures that sense of, are we ready for this?
Yeah.
Which I think many companies grapple with when expanding into the EU market. It's a balancing act between cost and compliance.
And then there's the issue of trust, right? You mentioned concerns about the reliability of certain Chinese testing labs.
Right.
And the possibility that some companies are getting CE markings without actually meeting the standards.
That's a valid concern, and it's something you need to be aware of when choosing a testing lab.
Yeah.
While there are reputable labs in China,
Right.
there are also some that may not have the same level of rigor or expertise as labs in other regions.
So how do you navigate that? How do you find a lab you can trust?
It's all about doing your due diligence.
Okay.
Look for labs that are accredited by recognized bodies. And don't be afraid to ask for references. You can also talk to other companies in your industry to see who they recommend.
And I remember you brought up Xiaomi as an example of a major Chinese company that does comply with those strict EU standards. It shows that it's possible to do things the right way, even if it's more expensive.
Exactly. And in the long run, investing in proper compliance can save you a lot of trouble down the road.
Right.
It protects your brand reputation and helps you build trust with consumers.
So we've gone through the ups and downs of testing in different regions,
Yeah.
from the confusion of quotes to the challenge of finding reliable labs.
Mm.
What are some key takeaways for our listeners before we move on to the final part of your recording?
I think the big picture lesson is this compliance is not a one-size-fits-all process.
Okay.
You need to tailor your approach based on the specific requirements of each market, your budget, and your risk tolerance.
It's about being proactive and strategic.
Right.
It's about doing your research and asking the right questions.
Exactly. And it's about understanding that compliance isn't just about checking boxes. It's about building a foundation for success in the global marketplace.
Okay, so as we head into this final part of your recording,
Mm.
you seem to be mapping out your game plan.
Yeah.
You talk about getting those super important product specification sheets from your R&D team
Right.
and reaching out to testing labs for like a formal quote on RCM testing.
Uh-huh.
You even specifically mentioned making sure the quote covers both of your product models.
Right.
Yeah, it includes that SDGO-C. It sounds like you're taking all the boxes.
Yeah, it's great to hear that you're taking such a systematic approach,
Yeah.
gathering all the essential information, clarifying those requirements, and really engaging with the testing labs proactively. That's a solid strategy for navigating these regulatory waters.
You also mentioned the possibility of needing to tweak your testing samples to meet the specific requirements of the RCM test procedures.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a bit of technical adaptation involved,
Right.
almost like fine-tuning a recipe to get it just right.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, and it highlights a crucial point.
Okay?
Compliance often extends beyond the product itself.
Right.
It might involve adjusting testing setups, tweaking documentation, or even refining internal processes.
Okay.
It's about looking at the bigger picture.
It's like preparing for a big trip.
Yeah,
You don't just book the flight. You
right.
pack your bags, you arrange transportation, you make sure you have the right currency.
Exactly. You need to consider all the details to ensure a smooth journey.
Now, towards the end of your recording, there's a moment of reflection where you seem to be weighing the costs and benefits of compliance,
Yeah.
particularly for the EU market. You acknowledge the significant expense,
Right.
but you also recognize the potential risks of non-compliance.
Uh-huh. It's a tough call.
It's that classic dilemma,
Yeah.
right? Balancing that upfront investment with the long-term gains.
Oh.
Market access, brand reputation, and avoiding those legal headaches.
It's like deciding whether to take the scenic route or the toll road.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
The scenic route might be cheaper,
Right.
but it could take longer and be full of unexpected detours.
Exactly.
The toll road is more expensive, but offers a faster and more predictable journey.
Right. It's about choosing the path that aligns best with your goals and your resources.
And those calculations can vary widely depending on the company, their target markets, their overall risk appetite.
Yeah.
There's no magic formula.
Absolutely. It's a decision that each company needs to make based on their own unique circumstances.
So having listened to your entire recording and dissected all the key points, what's the biggest takeaway for you and what should our listeners walk away with?
I think the ultimate lesson here is that navigating international product regulations is an ongoing process.
Okay.
It's a journey of learning, adapting, and making strategic decisions every step of the way. There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
It's about understanding the landscape,
Yeah.
embracing the complexity, and developing a compliance strategy that works for your business.
And that's where the real opportunity lies. By approaching compliance proactively and strategically, you can transform it from a potential roadblock into a competitive advantage. It's about turning lemons into lemonade.
Love that. Now, as we wrap up this deep dive, we always like to leave our listeners with something to ponder.
Okay.
Today's question is this: how might the growing emphasis on sustainability and ethical sourcing impact future product regulations?
Ooh.
Will we see new standards emerge, new challenges to overcome?
It's definitely a trend to keep a close eye on. As consumers demand more transparency and accountability, we can expect regulations to evolve accordingly.
It could have a significant impact on how products are designed, manufactured, and brought to market. It's a whole new dimension to consider.
Absolutely. It underscores the importance of staying informed, engaging in industry dialogue, and being proactive in anticipating those future compliance requirements.
Yeah,
Who knows, maybe we'll revisit this topic on a future deep dive.
sounds like a plan. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of international product regulations. Until next time, keep learning, keep innovating, and keep diving deep